Okay, can I welcome members and the public to this morning's meeting of the committee, and we will be undertaking evidence sessions today. But before we do that, can I just do a couple of housekeeping? Can I remind members, please turn your mobile phones off or on silent so that we are not interrupted during our sessions. The meeting is being broadcast live on Senedd TV, and a transcript of the proceedings will be published in the usual way. We operate a bilingual system in the Senedd, and therefore if you require simultaneous translation from Welsh to English, the headsets are available. That's channel 1. If you require amplification, that will be on channel 2. Also, there's no scheduled fire alarm this morning, so when it does take place, please follow the directions of the ushers to a safe location. Move on to the first evidence session. Can I welcome our witnesses, Professor Laura McAllister, who was chair of the expert panel of the Assembly Electoral Reform, and Professor Alan Renwick, who is a member of the expert panel on Senedd Reform. Welcome. I'm going to move into questions quite quickly because we have a shortish time, and perhaps I'll start with the first one. In your views, based upon the work you did in the expert panel, and I appreciate that we had a special purposes committee after that, and we've had other committees before after that and since time. But is there anything which you would have expected in the bill that isn't in the bill?
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Cadeirydd. Thank you very much. I think Alan and I are very cognizant that we worked on the expert panel report some 6 to 7 years ago now, and I think politics and constitutional matters have moved on since then. I don't think there's anything in the bill that is unexpected. I think some aspects of the bill are very much tidying up areas, for example, around the deputy PO and additional deputy PO and the term lengths. I think generally the issues and the debate around size is closely related to the ones that we had whilst we were working on the expert panel. Clearly the impact of Brexit is more clearly felt now in terms of the competences that have come to the Senedd since then. And I think there's also a more live debate around the deepening of powers for the institution than there was when we worked on our report, not least the independent commission that I'm chairing with Dr. Owen Williams, which of course is looking at all of these matters. So I don't think there's anything that isn't there that we thought should be there, although I think Alan and I will both want to challenge some of the content of the bill from the perspective of our analysis of how you enlarge the Senedd.
I would just say, clearly the two things where the expert panel made recommendations where either there isn't material in the bill or there's only limited material is in relation to gender quotas and job sharing. But I understand, of course, that on gender quotas there's separate legislation coming, and on job sharing there is at least a step in that direction in the bill.
Okay, thank you. We will go into some of those details, obviously, in the questioning. And I was more concerned as trying to find out if there's anything you think the bill missed an opportunity on, effectively, rather than meeting all these sort of expectations. Was there something that could have been done? Perhaps that'll tease out for some of the questions we move on. Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for being here this morning. I'm just going to ask a few questions then on the size of the Senedd, because you know, your expert panel recommended that it should be 80 to 90 members, but it's now being proposed to be 96. And you also said that you were not persuaded that the benefits of having more than 90 members would necessarily outweigh the resultant increase in cost. So could you explain to us a little bit how you came to that conclusion and what your thoughts are now that 96 has been proposed, please?
Yes, we undertook quite considerable research of an international comparator basis around size, and we tried to look as far as you ever can in a scientific way about what would be the appropriate size for the Senedd in the future. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, Sarah, we were recommending a bracket of between 80 and 90 and suggesting that the upper end of that bracket would be more appropriate given the form follows function approach that we've taken with our research. There's lots of evidence out there, of course, which compares institutions according to the competence that they have, the size of the population, any territorial issues and so on. And I think that was the right bracket for then. Of course, 96 is slightly above the recommended number that we put forward. And I just make 2 points on that. I think given what's happened in the meantime, that probably gives an added security to future-proofing the size of the Senedd, because nothing would be more problematic than to increase the size once and then have to go back and increase the size again within a relatively short period. That's relevant, of course, because there's a live debate about deepening and widening of powers of the Senedd, not just through our commission, but more widely. So I think that's important. Were something like justice to be devolved to Wales, and clearly there would be the need for a much bigger capacity of scrutiny, particularly, and potentially for the ministerial capacity side as well. I think the other point I'd make, and Alan would probably have additional ones, is that it's a very fine balance between cost and benefits, and also public opinion, because clearly you would want to bring the public with you on a journey towards enlarging the Senedd. That's not always easy, of course, as we all know. But we made the point that there was less return for the, in terms of benefits, for the cost that it would swallow were we to go above 90. So I think that argument has to be made for 96, based on that delicate balance between cost and benefit.
Of course, thank you.
Yes, so I agree with everything Laura has said there. Clearly it's a matter of balancing costs and benefits. So the benefits of increased size are particularly around greater opportunities for representation, and particularly greater opportunities for deeper scrutiny within the chamber. And the costs are principally simply financial costs, costs more clearly to run a bigger chamber, and potentially costs in relation to public opinion if there's a perception that more politicians, to use the sort of language that often would be used, is a bad thing. And I mean, I think it's clear that the benefits continue to grow, so there continues to be more benefit as you increase the size of the chamber. Looking back at our report from 6 years ago, it's quite striking that we talk about how even if you're increasing the number of members to the sort of range that we were talking about, in order to gain benefits in terms of members being able to specialise to a greater degree, not having to be on multiple committees, it would still be necessary to have quite a lot of constraint upon the number of members of a committee, the number of committees. So, you know, the benefits continue to develop further as you go beyond 90 in terms of being able to have a stronger scrutiny system. But the costs clearly grow as well. And our calculation at the time was that those costs become harder to justify as you go into that range. But as Laura says, if you take into account that we are 6 years further down the line now, there have been lots of changes. As Laura said, Brexit in particular has happened and brings additional changes. And the desirability of future-proofing is considerable. Yes. So I don't, you know, I would be quite comfortable with 96 as a number at this stage.
Okay, thank you. So just to clarify, the report was 6 years ago, and when you did it, you based the 80 to 90 on the current powers, not on the potential future powers, which, as you said, could be justice.
Yes, except we did note that the debate was ongoing over further areas of devolution, and also the point that I made about not wanting to have to revisit this question. Hence, our recommendation was at the upper end of the 80 to 90 figure.
Okay, thank you very much. And just my last question then. You've touched on this a few times, but it would be good just to get a solid, clear answer. Do you think the costs proposed for the implementation of the bill appear to be proportionate compared to those published by the expert panel?
I think they do, yes. I look closely at the detail of the costs, and whilst I didn't sit down with a calculator and work out what inflation was on each of those and rising costs around energy and everything else, yes, I think they're certainly in line with the calculations that we worked on for the additional members back in 2016. Of course, it's always extremely difficult to work out exactly what ongoing and one-off costs are for this. I'd make one other relevant point, if I may, which follows on from Alan's. I think once you go beyond 90 members, I think there needs to be a really forensic conversation about how you staff members as well. Okay. Because I think we're pushing at the upper end of what is appropriate for the powers that we have currently and what might happen in the near future. I wouldn't like to see the benefits of having politicians being diluted, particularly by having heavy staff complements, because I think our argument in the expert panel was that staff, whilst they're tremendous and do wonderful work, and I've seen that at first hand, they can't do the work that a politician does. They, the rationale for increasing the size of the Senedd has to be about specialisation for members and the time and the thinking space that you need to be able to scrutinise effectively. And I've always felt very sympathetic to you as politicians who sit on several committees, because it's almost impossible for you to prepare in a way that allows you to generate the kind of scrutiny that you want to do. So my argument, or my point really, is that we need to be mindful that once we go over the 90 threshold, that there probably needs to be a revisiting of what staffing resource is given to the members as well. That's not suggesting you diminish that, but you don't necessarily increase it in line with the increase in the politicians.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Can I ask a question on this one then? Because 96 is above your previous limit. You've indicated that you were looking at future-proofing. We don't know how far that, or how far away that might be yet. Have you considered, or did you consider, a combination of increasing the number of members plus a changing in the ways in which the Senedd works?
Yes, we did. We spent quite a lot of time at looking at alternatives to enlarging the Senedd. You know, the areas that you know about, obviously. Expanding the working week, using the working week differently, streamlining the committees, reducing the membership of the committees and so on. But there's an obvious trade-off with all of that, which seemed very clear to us, which was that with a very small number of non-ministerial MSs, your capacity to do things differently is still massively constrained. There's also an argument, of course, that if you don't increase the number of politicians but change the operational format of the institution, you become dependent on non-political capacity here. So staff, and not just staff of politicians, but staff of the Commission themselves. And I don't think that necessarily enhances the scrutiny objective, which was the key rationale for why we were recommending an enlargement of the Senedd.
Thank you. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I don't have a view, to be honest, on the financial cost calculations. That's beyond my expertise. So, yeah, I think we can move on.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Darren.
Can I just pick up on the costs issue for a moment, if I may? Because you're right, this does influence how people feel about the proposals and whether they support their implementation or not. So in your report in 2017, you indicated an upper cost end, which presumably was based on an additional 30 members, of £9.6 million per annum. I don't know how you drilled that down to... I know that there were some tables with costs in the document. There are two questions I've got about this. One, when I have just put that through the Bank of England inflation tool on their website, it suggests that the annual cost for 30 extra members, not 36 as proposed, would be about £12.26 million per year on a sort of recurrent basis. Obviously, these figures appear to be significantly higher than that, disproportionately higher than that, when you take into account there are only an extra 6 members. So the Welsh Government's calculations are around 17 million in terms of the annual recurrent costs on a yearly basis. Now, appreciating there's been inflation, but I've just taken that into account. Is there any reason that you think it's so significantly different? Were there any areas that when you looked at it you thought, well, actually, you know, perhaps that could be significantly greater, but we'll allow this? Or
Not that I'm aware of, but as I say, I very much lack expertise on this. I mean, the point that I would make is that you're absolutely right, clearly, to scrutinise these figures very carefully when we're thinking about the merits of a larger Senedd. It seems to me that in the grand scheme of things, these are fairly small sums of money, and the benefits of a well-functioning legislature are very, very considerable. So, you know, it's absolutely right to be careful about the costs, but I'm just wary of placing too much emphasis on those when we're looking at the bill as a whole.
Can I just, if I may, Darren, jump in on that issue? You'll also see in our report that we talked about some counsel to the Independent Remuneration Board not to assume that everything necessarily had to be done in the same way with more members, because it's back to the point I made to Sarah. You know, if you have more members and you expect work to be done differently, and I've worked with the Remuneration Board, so I'm very aware that some of the conversations that we'd had in the past were about compensating for an under-resourced political capacity. So some of the proposals that were being made were to help MSs because there were so few of them.
So your figures took into account sort of reduction in staffing levels?
Well, we certainly looked at that. I mean, the figures were ballpark figures as they had to be at that point. You know, they weren't. We didn't have the time or the space, or as Alan said, the expertise to drill into the absolute detail of that. But I think that's a live consideration for how you might want to support professionally 96 politicians, and therefore, you know, I'm not sure if that was taken into account with the Welsh Government figures that were put.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just looking at the figures, they're 38% higher than you'd expect them to be, if, accounting for inflation. Okay.
Before we go on, Dan, because Helen wants to come in on this particular point.
Yeah, but I shall go.
Yes, I will be contributing in Welsh. I just wanted to pursue the capacity issue specifically. Are you talking about the staff of elected members or commission staff? Because clearly there is a major difference there, and one of the things that we have seen recently is that as more people become aware of the Senedd, that there has been an increase in casework for staff in constituencies and regions as compared to MPs. So I just wanted to understand that issue of capacity, because there is a difference between commission staff and member staff.
Agree, and I'm certainly not suggesting for a moment that there should be a reduction in either the staff of the Commission or the staff that work individually for politicians individually. But I think it would be wrong not to look at the support structure around the body of politicians if the body of politicians increases. Because the evidence that we took in our expert panel, including from the Hansard Society and various other organisations and individuals, made the point quite clearly that the biggest asset to effective scrutiny is the time and the specialisation of politicians. You can compensate for that, and I don't need to tell you that, obviously, by having great staff who are doing the research for you. But at the end of the day, it's you that needs to be in the committee room or challenging budgets and so on. So I think that needs a debate, and I would be very surprised if the Independent Remuneration Board wouldn't be looking at that in some detail. But I don't think that necessarily means a reduction. It might mean a recalibration or restructuring of how people work in order to give you the capacity to scrutinise effectively.
Can I follow up on that? Sorry, Darren. Can I just ask them, because obviously one of the things that Westminster has is in terms of relation access to short money and so on to support the nature of opposition work, which is different. So when you talk about recalibration, do you think we just need to look at how everything works together in terms of supporting policy development work and so on, some of the things, you know, that may be lacking at present?
Yes, I mean, Alan might want to talk about the short scenario in the House of Commons, but for me, you know, I think this is an opportunity as well to look strategically at the support that you have as politicians. I think what's happened over the 24 years of devolution is that things have been bolted on to compensate for an underpowered Senedd, and that's not necessarily the best and strategic way of doing it. And I'm not suggesting that the House of Commons has got this perfectly right by any means, but I think this is an opportunity for the Independent Remuneration Board to look at the things in the round to make sure that you are resourced in a way that allows you to discharge those responsibilities.
Yeah.
Just another aspect of cost, obviously, is making this building fit for purpose and providing sufficient office space for bums on seats, as it were, and the kit that people might need. The Senedd Commission figures seem to be rather lower than you would expect in terms of their estimates. It's £1.8 million worth of capital expenditure to make all of the adjustments in the Senedd chamber and office space. What figures did you arrive at when you were considering these matters? Can you remind us?
They're in the report.
Well, we split them, didn't we, into
Yes.
recurring
Capital,
costs
yes.
and recurring costs and one-off costs,
Yes, yeah.
and obviously the capital costs were included in those. But I'm not going to pretend to be expert enough to know if the restructuring of this building with its resources is accurately reflected in that number. I mean, I can only imagine that the Commission has broken that down into the areas you mentioned, Darren, around. Okay.
I wouldn't be asking you. Okay, well, we'll make sure that we refer to the report. Can I turn everybody's attention then to the issue of the number of ministers that's proposed in this bill? In your evidence, Alan Renwick, you made reference to the fact that, you know, one of the principles, if you like, of Senedd expansion should be the growth of the executive should be smaller than the growth of the Parliament itself, so that can aid and improve scrutiny. Do you think that they've gotten the balance right, the Welsh Government, in the bill that they've put forward?
Yes. So, so the proposal, of course, is that Senedd would increase by 60%, and the number of ministers would increase by a little over a third, if you include the First Minister and the Councillor General in the number of ministers. So that basic principle is adhered to. I mean, I don't have a view on what the kind of exact number of ministers ought to be. You need much greater expertise on Wales than I have in order to calculate that exact figure. But so certainly that number is within the right sort of range. As I said in my evidence, the point in the bill that I have more concerns around is the suggestion that it would be possible through regulations for ministers further to increase that number by 2. And it just seems to me a really fundamental point that it shouldn't be for ministers to decide an increase in the number of ministers. That ought to be a decision that is made by the Senedd as a whole through full scrutiny, i.e. through primary legislation. So that is a point in the bill that I would have a clear concern about.
So ministers obviously could only introduce those regulations if there was a vote in the Senedd, is what we're told. And of course it would take the number of ministers from the current 12 up to 17 and then up to 19 potentially with the vote. I mean, one thing that there doesn't appear to be in the legislation is any mechanism to peel that back to 17 if there's a new incoming government, for example. Do you think that that's something which should be in the bill?
Well, I think the provision in the bill should simply not be there. I mean, it should simply be for primary legislation to decide that maximum number.
But 17's about right. You'd agree with that, would you?
I agree entirely with Alan's point about primary legislation and about a supermajority for changing that, because I think that's right for a constitutional matter of this import. Just in defence of the increase, which I think is proportionate, as Alan said, to the size of the legislature, it's the issue over widening of powers in the future, but it's also the issue of the size of the portfolios that ministers currently have. which I think are too large and unwieldy. In terms of the scope of coverage and being able to discharge those responsibilities well. So I think on balance the increase that's being suggested is about right, with the provisos that Alan has made around securing that only through primary legislation and in my opinion supermajorities in the Senedd.
So up to 19 is about right, or up to 17? Could you just clarify that?
Well, I think up to 17 is right.
Yeah.
But I don't object to a future increase subject to the caveats that we've made here. And that I think would only appropriately be brought forward if there was to be a widening of the powers of the Senedd, for example, to include justice or additional powers over welfare or broadcasting.
So there have to be a clear business case, as it were, justification for that increase.
I think that would be the nature of the debate in the Senedd, or if it was primary legislation coming forward, and I think that's appropriate for it to be scrutinised in that way.
And just in terms of the balance here, so an additional 5 ministers, potentially up to an additional 7 ministers. On the parliamentary side, the scenarios that are set out suggest just an additional 3 committees of the Senedd in order to assist with the scrutiny of those roles. Is that enough?
It would depend on the nature of the ministerial roles, clearly. Generally you want to have a mapping of the ministerial roles and committee roles. And I'm not sure exactly what is being proposed there, but that ought to be the principle that should be upheld.
But 3 would be enough, would it? Because, the scenarios range from 1 to 3 committees.
It's very difficult, obviously, for us to comment on how a future Senedd should operate, because I think that's a decision for the Senedd itself, with advice from the Commission. But I think it's back to my point about whether the Senedd acquires additional powers. I mean, justice generates a huge area of potential scrutiny, doesn't it, with all aspects of the criminal justice system, including police, probation, prisons and so on. So I don't know how that would you as a Senedd would wish to map that across the committee structure. But I think our report does give some useful intelligence about how committees should be balanced, that they shouldn't be too big and unwieldy, but neither should they be so small that you can't reach quorum, and also that you can't build organisational expertise within the group. But I think it would be wrong of us to be too prescriptive over how the committee structure would look in the future.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'll be asking my questions in Welsh. Good morning. A first question for Alan, if that's okay. Now, it's very helpful to have the evidence that you've provided to the committee on the bill currently before us, and that's very helpful indeed. Thank you very much for that. In paragraph 15 of your evidence, I don't know if you'd want to review that, you talk about voter choice, and you also mention that you're not content with the system that's being proposed, namely the closed list system, because that restricts voter choice. Can you just tell us more about that? Because that comes across from everything that you've written on the bill before us. Thank you.
Yes, certainly, thank you. So we have, in all democracies at present, a lot of public dissatisfaction with how democracy functions. We have particular dissatisfaction and disillusionment, I'm sorry to say, with politicians, and a concern that politicians. I'm not expressing a view on this. I'm just saying this is.
We are aware of the public's views.
Yes. Public perception that politicians are out of touch. All of the things that you are very familiar with. We have abundant evidence from various sources that removing from voters the opportunity to vote for an individual politician, to choose an individual person on the ballot paper, would further enhance that dissatisfaction. I did a big study a few years ago of voting systems across all European countries, and there has been a very clear trend over recent decades towards giving voters greater choice at the level of individual candidates, precisely in order to respond to that concern. In the UK in particular, clearly the UK democratic tradition is one of voting for individuals in elections. And we see that in first past the post for Westminster elections, but also under the additional member system, people are able to vote for individual candidates. And we've done a lot of recent survey evidence looking at public attitudes to democracy in the UK, and people really value accountability. They really value the principle of being able to throw the rascals out, and that includes at the government level, but also at the individual level. So it just seems to me very, very clear that to remove that ability from voters to vote for individual candidates would create a significant danger of increasing public disaffection with the system. And when we're talking about a reform to increase the number of politicians, when that is the context, then the suggestion that you also then change the voting system in order to give voters less power to determine who the individual politicians filling those seats are seems to me really dangerous. And I just would urge the committee and the Senedd as a whole to think very seriously about whether it really wants to go down that kind of path.
Just question Bill.
Thank you, and just a brief question. So, what you're clear on, I think, and I just want to confirm this if I may, you seem to be saying that what's before us now, the closed list system, is not allowing voters to have that choice. As I understand from your evidence, the party makes that choice in terms of who will be included on that closed list, and you also have a view on a system that would provide more of that voter choice. I think you say in paragraph 17, I believe, that the flexible list system would be more acceptable in your view. I just want to confirm that that is your view.
Yes, certainly. So, I mean, clearly under a closed list system, voters directly do not have any influence over which of the parties' candidates are elected. Presumably, when parties are deciding who goes at the top of the list, they're going to take into account public opinion, and they're going to want to have more popular people at the top of the list. So it's not as though there isn't an indirect influence there, but there's no direct connection. And so there are two kinds of system that the expert panel considered that would give voters choice at the individual candidate level. The panel recommended in favour of a single transferable vote system, which in a sense maximises the amount of choice that is available to voters and the degree of influence that voters have in determining which of a party's candidates are elected. And you, of course, will be very familiar with STV systems. But the expert panel also indicated that it would be acceptable to have a flexible list system. And a flexible list system is one in which each party presents a list of candidates in a determined order, so that the party decides what order that is. But voters have some ability to change that order. So it's less... it's more kind of balanced between party control and voter control, whereas STV goes fully over to voter control and closed lists go fully to party control. And there are a zillion different forms of flexible list system that you can imagine, but in the report we suggested keep things simple, and you can just have a system where each voter is able to vote for one candidate from the list of their chosen party, and any candidates who get above a specified percentage of the vote go to the top of the list, essentially. So it's a very simple system to operate. It's easy for voters to understand, easy for administrators to administer, and that would achieve that balance.
Next question.
If I may just come in, clearly my party favours STV, as do the Liberal Democrats. But do you agree that in terms of the closed list, that one of the things it can facilitate is the introduction of integrated gender quotas? It can be more easily achieved through that system. So although it is a system that does cause problems, if we do want to move forward on gender quotas and equality, then it does reduce the risk by having those closed lists.
Yeah, and Laura might want to come in on this as well. But clearly with a closed list or with a flexible list, you can have a zipped list of candidates. It's not just where you have a gender quota that you have a certain... You require equality in terms of the number of candidates, but you also have alternating female-male, female-male. If you have a closed list, voters cannot change that. If you have a flexible list, it is possible that voters will decide to prioritise people in a way that disturbs that balance. So yes, it is the case that a closed list system guarantees that the equality that you pursue through the gender quota system is reflected in the result. I mean, it is also the case that over time, voters have been getting less prejudiced in their voting behaviour. So more recent studies find less of an effect, and indeed some studies find that women benefit from preferential, from individual candidate voting. So, you know, how big a concern that is something that would require careful thought in Wales, I guess.
Okay, jump in on that. I think you can overplay the guarantee part of the closed list with regard to gender balance, because, as Alan mentioned, the open list system can be made to work in a very similar way. And all of the research that my colleagues who work in this area around gender quotas are doing at the moment shows that very point that Alan made at the end, which is that voters actually can favour female candidates, or indeed candidates from different ethnic backgrounds as well, through the threshold approach that you can have within flexible open lists. I understand that's being put forward as one of the arguments in favour of closed lists, you know, a safer guarantee, but the evidence suggests that argument is weakening as electors become less discriminatory towards female candidates or candidates of different ethnic backgrounds. So I don't think it's as strong as you might think. And one further point about the integration of gender quotas. I appreciate that this is will be in a separate bill, but nevertheless, we're talking about the electoral system per se. I think it's really important that we don't just interpret quotas as being the vertical zipping of lists, because the biggest impact that you can have is if you horizontally manage the process of quotas according to winnable seats, so therefore lists across various constituencies by different parties. If you have those two things together, you can almost certainly guarantee a better gender balance than using just gender quotas, vertically in a closed list. So it's really important to see the bigger context to that as well.
Yeah.
Darren, do you want to come in?
Yes, I mean, Laura's already answered the question about the fact that the proposed zipping arrangements...
If she's asked the question, we are tight on time.
...won't necessarily deliver a balanced Senedd without other action perhaps being taken. But you can assure us that this issue of ensuring gender zipping can still take place within a flexible list system, which is what you've already confirmed.
We modelled that ourselves in the expert panel, so I think there's evidence there, and other countries have done it as well, so there's plenty of international evidence for that.
Yeah, great.
Just a further question from me. In the Fourth Assembly, now you assessed voting models as board with 10 principles, I think I'm right on that. We found that very helpful. So in your view, therefore, we have this proposal now of the closed list that we've already discussed. Now, you've touched on this, but what is your view of that assessment that you made in the 4th Assembly, and in analysing against it what's been proposed now?
Let me be really frank. I mean, we rejected the closed list system very early on in our deliberations in the expert panel because it didn't meet most of the criteria against which we were measuring it. Specifically, and I think these were the key issues for us, it gives too much power to the party and not enough power to the elector, as Alan said. So it weakens that area of voter autonomy and voter choice, which is, I think, a dangerous precedent in the current climate that's already been described. And that it doesn't allow for any direct line of accountability between a politician and the voter. It allows a direct line of accountability between the party and the voter. And to be fair to arguments for closed lists, that is in line with the party-dominated culture that we have in the UK generally. But I think, if anything, when people are aware of the fact that they won't be able to actually choose a specific candidate, that will be chosen for them, I think that could cause some real issues in terms of public support for any change. The only other thing I'd say in favour of closed lists is that, depending on how you operationalise them, you know, here we're talking about 16 constituencies with district magnitude of 6. That should deliver a degree of greater proportionality, but it might not if the electoral arithmetic changes in the future, because 6 is a relatively small district magnitude. It might not generate a great deal more proportionality, which for me seems like a heavy price to pay for the weaknesses of closed lists as well. And there's also the issue of smaller parties. You know, how will they be represented given the calculation method for translating votes into seats is d'Hondt, which traditionally favours the largest party, or the party with the largest number of votes. So I think, I mean, I don't know whether you want to go into this, and I'm certainly not an expert about arithmetic calculations. Alan knows far more about that than I do, but it's always worth thinking about how this might be modelled using the San-Lagou system as well, which tends to allow more opportunity because it's a different method for smaller parties to be elected. But it's far from perfect. I mean, the closed list system was rejected by our panel early on in our considerations against those principles that you mentioned.
Helen, it's your turn anyway, Helen.
Thank you. If I could move on from there, the explanatory memorandum states that there will be a review of closed lists after 2026, so if it is adopted it will need to be reviewed. Do you anticipate that there could be a relatively smooth move from closed lists to flexible or open lists if we were to shift to STV post 2026? Do you think that the rest of the package facilitates that? 96 members, 16 six-member constituencies and so on?
So a shift from a closed list to a flexible list system is very easy to do. A shift from closed lists to STV is a little bit more, but actually not that much more complicated. And similarly, you can do any of these systems in a system with 6-member districts. It makes a bit of a difference to the counting process, the ballot paper, that kind of thing. But it's not difficult to make that shift.
Can I add on one question from that then? If such changes happen, can we confuse the electorate? Because we are talking about one system for 2026 possibly, and then maybe a different system altogether for 2030. So how do we engage with the electorate to ensure that they understand those proposed changes?
Yeah, that is certainly a danger, and voters already have to deal with multiple different voting systems across different elections in the UK, and specifically in Wales. But you're right, changing the system repeatedly can only add to that confusion. I wouldn't exaggerate the extent of the problem, I guess. I mean, it's reasonable. From the voter's point of view, none of these systems are actually terribly complicated, particularly when you get into STV. And if you start looking under the bonnet, then it gets scarily complicated. But the voter doesn't need to worry about that.
I think as well, the review is really important. I mean, whatever comes out of the process of the bill's scrutiny, I think ensuring a really muscular review is absolutely critical, because I'm sure that, if you pursue the closed list, there will be unintended consequences of that, which you would wish to then review at the end of the period. And I would hope that, I like the term healthy democracy and so on, but you really need to get under the bonnet of that and explain exactly what you mean. Is that about turnout, or is it about citizens understanding the intelligibility of the system and maybe different demographics and how that's played out? The other point I'd make, Chair, if I may, is that obviously I would like to see the internal democracy of Wales treated in the round, so that we looked at local government as well. And of course local government does have the opportunity to pilot different electoral systems, and it would be wonderful if we had pilots on STV in local government during this period. I appreciate that not many are enthusiastic about this at the moment. Nevertheless, wouldn't it be good, because you'd have another body of evidence of how STV works and representativeness from that as well, whilst you have a closed list system operating for the Senedd. I know that might sound a bit, naive, but it would be a great piece of research and evidence for the review that you would have after the period of the next Senedd.
Diolch.
If I could move now to boundaries, and this is a specific question for Alan. In your evidence, you question the 10% flexibility either way by the Boundary Commission in putting in place the permanent boundaries from 2030 onwards. We've seen some practical examples of setting too tighter quota of 5% with Westminster boundaries, therefore losing that community connection in areas such as the Swansea Valley, where that area is in a Westminster seat, with Brecon. Now, do you accept, therefore, that the change of boundaries between the interim in 2026 and the full boundaries in 2030 could be an opportunity to enhance relations between communities, as well as the risk of damaging those?
So the point that I made in my written evidence is simply that the principle of democratic equality is a really important principle, and to the extent that you move away from equal numbers of members across constituencies, you move away from that principle of democratic equality, and it's important therefore to have a good justification for doing so. Now, you've just offered a good justification for doing so, and community ties clearly do matter. What I was suggesting in my evidence is this is just an issue to think about very carefully, and to think about where the balance of those things most appropriately lies. And we have now seen the Westminster level boundary review work through with the 5% flexibility, and in most cases that seems to have been fine, and it hasn't caused huge problems. You mentioned a case where you know much better than I do, but there may be concerns. But there has never been a boundary review where there weren't some communities that were split up and were upset about it. So wherever you set that threshold, there is going to be a trade-off. And I just think it's important to think carefully about whether there is sufficient justification for having such a broad range of flexibility as is in the bill at the moment. I think you need a very clear justification for that.
Diolch fawr iawn.
Thank you very much. If I could ask, therefore, about the Democracy and Boundary Commission, Cymru specifically, do you have any view as to whether this is the appropriate body to conduct boundary reviews for Senedd constituencies? And also, do you have any views on the appointment of members to the Commission and how should that be conducted?
So I think it certainly is the appropriate body. I mean, it should be a body in Wales that is responsible for this. And I think the principle of what's termed automaticity among nerds like me in the implementation of boundary reviews is a desirable one that's being introduced. So the current UK government introduced that in the Parliamentary Constituencies Act for for UK boundary reviews, and I think it's absolutely right that that should be applied in Wales as well. But it is key if you remove the ability of the Senedd to have some kind of check at the end of the process of boundary reviews, that you're absolutely sure that the boundary review process itself is free from undue political interference. Mm-hmm. And so I gave evidence with Robert Hazel, my colleague at the UCL Constitution Unit, to the committee that looked at the Westminster legislation on this. And we argued very strongly that in that case there needed to be greater protections for the independence of the boundary commissions from the potential for interference from the executive. And I think exactly the same applies here. So as far as I can see, for example, there's no requirement that the commissioners should not be members of political parties, which would seem to me like a fairly obvious basic starting point. So some thought around exactly what are the constraints upon appointments, who can be appointed would be appropriate. Some thought around the process of appointment would be appropriate. There's very little in the legislation currently about how the commissioners are appointed, and ensuring that there's some kind of independent process that produces either a candidate or a small list of candidates from whom ministers then choose would seem to be appropriate. And then finally, the kind of key point that we made in our evidence to the Westminster Committee on this was that commissioners should be appointed for non-renewable terms, so that there's no danger of their being inappropriately influenced in order to hope for re-election. Mm-hmm. And so my colleague Robert Hazel has worked on the independence, protecting the independence of regulators and other such bodies a great deal, and he argues that that is the most important principle of all the principles that needs to be applied to these kinds of bodies.
Can I say something as well? I agree entirely with Alan. I think there's not enough substance around how the Commission would be constituted and worked for us to be able to judge whether that automatic principle should be enacted in the way we think it should. And I think we would need to look at the Public Appointments Code and framework, because clearly there are prohibitions there for some public bodies around political party membership, yes, and so on. And the other small point I'd make is that I think territorial representation is really important for the appointments of the new commissioners as well, so that you don't have a body that is entirely from the south of the country or the north of the country or whatever, that there is a territorial diversity as well, and that should be really built in, because that's the only way the public will feel that it has a legitimacy and integrity of its own.
Certainly, yeah. Yep.
Darren, you have 4 minutes.
Sorry?
You have 4 minutes.
I have 4 minutes. Can I ask you about residency requirements, if that's okay? So in the bill, it proposes that in order to be both a candidate and a member of the Senedd, you must live in Wales. I think everybody's got sympathy with that, with that point. But some people have suggested that it might be better to have a local connection to a constituency rather than a simple qualification to live in Wales. So, for example, at the moment, under the suggested arrangements, you could live in Cardiff but represent a constituency in in the Alyn and Deeside sort of area, but you couldn't live in Chester immediately next door and represent and stand as a candidate for Alyn and Deeside. Do you think that that's satisfactory? Do you have any views on that? Should there be something about proximity to constituency, or about a constituency connection in addition to the rules that we have? Is that something that you've considered?
If I'm being really honest, I haven't considered that in detail,
Yep.
but I'll give you a view, and Alan might have a different one,
Yep.
which is I think there's a difference between local and national within the picture of Wales. I think it's completely anomalous to have representatives in this Senedd who don't live within the national boundaries of Wales. The difficulty I could see with your point, Alan, is Darren, sorry, is that in a way that should probably be left up to the political parties to decide, because people who might be on the electoral register in Cardiff might have very strong family and backgrounds in Clwyd, for example. So should we be determining that based on where their current place of work and residence is, rather than where they may be making their home and working in the future? So I'm not sure that that can be done effectively through the bill. It may be that that's something that the parties would take into account more naturally in terms of the selection of their candidate.
I guess I would say that the principle of voter choice is really important here. So that firstly means that voters should in general be able to elect whoever they want to elect, unless there are very good reasons for having constraints on that. But secondly, clearly voters should be able to choose someone that they want. And so this interacts with the question of list flexibility, and I would have... So if you have a system where voters don't have any say over individual candidates, then potentially parties are able to put at the top of lists candidates whom voters don't particularly feel any sense of connection with. And in that scenario, potentially there's greater justification for putting limits on the parties in order to protect voters' likelihood of having candidates that they want. Whereas if you have flexible lists, then there's greater ability for voters to say, well, to decide whether they want a candidate who lives outside the constituency or not.
Okay, and with the current arrangements kicking in at the point of candidature rather than on election, do you think there's an issue there? So at the moment we have rules around individuals who can stand for election and not disqualified from becoming candidates, but may have to resign from things if they do become a member, for example. So they're not disqualified at the point of candidature. Do you think that there's an issue to consider here about whether the disqualification kicks in at the point of candidature rather than the point of election?
I can see the issues. I can see the benefits, actually, of each side of
both,
that.
yes.
Because clearly, if we want to create a more diverse Senedd, people are taking a risk in terms of standing for election. There's never any guarantee that one will be elected, despite maybe even being towards the top of a closed list. So it might be prohibitive to candidates who want to put themselves forward if you stop it being at the point of candidature rather than acceptance of the position. But I haven't got much more to say than that, really. Okay. I think there's a risk attached to both sides of that.
Yeah, I don't have a more developed thought than that either. But it's an interesting question.
I'm going to hold it until, because I'm aware that Professor McAllis has to leave on time.
Okay.
But I'll add an extra one to this. Obviously, some of the people who are disqualified on election are usually in posts which may be remunerated.
Yes.
Whereas candidatures you're not remunerated as candidate. So there's a slightly different consideration there as well.
Can I ask just one final question?
We haven't got time, Dan. Professor McAllis has to...
really brief one, right?
It's up to Professor McAllis. She has to leave.
We're just going straight into our constitutional commission. But
it was just a really simple, straightforward question. Under the current arrangements, any constituency that's twinned with Anglesey to form a Senedd constituency will have about 25,000 fewer voters than everywhere else. Do you think it's right that that should still have 6 members of the Senedd in the first Senedd term? Or should it have 5?
Well, I think if you move away from the same district magnitude across the whole of Wales, you bring in different challenges and different problems. I think the issue is whether we accept that Ynysmore and Anglesey requires that provision, and if we do, then I think we have to live with the fact that that will be a constituency with a smaller electorate, but the same number of elected members. I think it could open up a whole set of other problems were you to change the district magnitude for one of the constituencies out of the 16.
Now, at that point, we'll end the session.
Great.
Can I thank you both for your evidence session today? It's been very helpful. As you know, or you should know, you will receive a copy of the transcript. For any actual inaccuracies, can you please let the clerk and teams know as soon as possible? Thank you. And on that note, we'll now take a short break before the next evidence session, and we should resume at 10:30.